Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, August 14th, and we will be hearing the presentation Perspectives on Resiliency Planning. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in your GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box located in your tool panel. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. I do ask that if your question is for a particular panelist, that you put their name somewhere within the question so I know who to direct it to. There we go. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2020. Thanks to all of those sponsoring for making these webcasts possible and free to members. In particular, today's webcast is sponsored by the Transportation Planning Division of APA. So thanks to you guys for joining us and for putting this panel together on this super important and popular topic. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming webcasts. This is actually a screenshot of our webcast webpage. Head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and that's where you'll see an updated list of all the sessions that are available for registration. I'd like to note that up at the top, there's a couple different tabs. If you click the prior webcast tab, you can download a PDF copy of the slide decks of all of our previous webcasts. The distance education tab, if you click that, you can get more information on our on-demand sessions that are available through the end of the year. We do have a couple law and a couple ethics available for you. So make sure you check those out. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. This session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log those AICP CM credits by heading over to planning.org, logging into your My APA account, and then searching either by today's title or the event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. Like us on Facebook, Planning Webcast Series, to receive up-to-date information on our sessions when we have new sessions available for you to register, or if we have a late date change or something change, we'll post that up onto our Facebook page. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We record all of our sessions and post them there. So be sure to subscribe, and you will be joining over 3,000 other subscribers. We have over 300 videos there for you. So be sure to check us out. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube. Okay, that's it for my housekeeping items. Let's get this show on the road. I am now going to turn it over to Charlie Sullivan, who will kick off today's presentation and introduce our panelists. Charlie, the floor is yours.
All right. All right, can y'all see the slideshow or the notes?
I think you might have maybe paused your screen. We saw it for a second and then it disappeared. Let me try one more time. I'll send it back to you. I just sent you an invite again. Okay, there we go. And then if you could just go up to display settings and swap your screens. Perfect. Good to go.
Got it. All right. This is on resiliency planning. We do not mean this as an introduction to planning, but as a exploring on different perspectives. What we have is a medium-sized MPO, a very large MPO, and the state. I can talk about how each one of them are addressing resiliency. A little background first. Resiliency planning is fairly new. 100 years ago, everyone was in the mud and the focus was get the farmer out of the mud, is what we call it in Texas. That's not inappropriate based on the pressing problems they had 100 years ago. That was absolutely what they needed to do. 50 years ago, we had pavement, so the big push was efficiency for cars. And again, that was based on what they were going through then. It was appropriate. Now we have a wider need. We see a greater scope for transportation planning in many areas, things like safety, complete streets, freight planning, vulnerability resilience is just one of the new things that are actually not new because the need has always been there, but now we're recognized the need to look at those in planning. Just real briefly, a definition: vulnerability is how we're at risk, the different stressors that we're addressing, like wildfire, drought, high temperature, flooding. And resilience, a lot of different definitions. The one I like best, it says our ability to absorb shocks gracefully. Now, even though resiliency planning is fairly new, it's not isolated. And one of the things I'd like to just mention briefly is performance goals from the Federal Aid Highway Program. If you look at them just even briefly, each of them is directly impacted by vulnerability and resilience. So even though resilience planning is new, it's not isolated, but like safety, like complete streets, it's folded in every aspect of planning as we go forward. So to introduce our speakers just real briefly, I'm Charlie Sullivan with CDM Smith in Austin, Texas, mainly a modeler and planner. From our medium-sized MPO, we have Kendra Sufal. Colleen Temple is right next to Fort Hood, which is the largest Army base in the world. She has like 17 different incorporated cities, and Kendra is the planning manager. And then just real briefly, one of the reasons we picked Kendra is that Colleen is just starting out in their resiliency planning, so it's like a first step. And then in contrast to that, we have Justin Bauer from the Houston-Galveston Area Council, which is not only a different perspective because they're so much larger, but it's a different perspective because they are more mature, more wide-ranging, more practice in doing it. And then from the state perspective, we have Bill Knowles, who's head of the Transportation Planning and Programming Division in the Traffic Analysis section. Travel demand model development, travel surveys, statewide data collection, and also all of TxDOT resiliency planning. A lot of research, and then Bill does not only the state perspective, but the research perspective. So without saying anything more, I will turn it on over to Kendra to talk about the perspective of the medium-sized MPO.
Kendra, did you? Oh, there you are. Perfect.
Okay. One moment. Okay. The Colleen Temple MPO is an MPO and TMA in Central Texas, about 100 miles north of Austin. Its population is 370,000 and spread among 14 incorporated cities and the residential portion of Fort Hood. Geographically, KTMPO is right along the I-35 corridor, which divides the hill country to the west and the low Blackland Prairie to the east. The hill country is known for small limestone hills, scrub oak, and cedar. And to the east, the Blackland Prairie has heavy clay soils and more agricultural use. Our larger urbanized areas lie along I-35, I-14, and US 190. Our project scoring process featured 2 evaluation tracks depending on the type of a project, a road track and a transportation choices and livability track. We developed these tracks as an update to our evaluation process to provide more equitable scoring for multimodal and active transportation projects. Each evaluation track has objective and subjective components and is designed to evaluate a wide range of project characteristics. Each evaluation track briefly considered the environment in a general way, but we determined to improve this process with a more robust consideration of vulnerability and resilience. We developed and adopted vulnerability and resilience process in 4 stages. First, we gathered the data in a formal system. We defined 4 stressors in part based on their having available data from well-maintained sources. We defined the regional vulnerability and resilience framework as a formal system to organize and manage the data. Then we evaluated the data from defined stressors. We defined geographic areas and used them to evaluate the transportation system for vulnerability. Third, we integrated the results into project planning. The framework was designed to seamlessly define data that is compatible with our existing project evaluation process. And last, support vulnerability and resilience planning. Adding vulnerability and resilience criteria to our project scoring is just the beginning of our efforts. The first step in developing a data framework was to define a 1/4 mile grid for the whole study area. That gave us a common geography to use to manage the data for our 4 stressors. This is called the Regional Vulnerability and Resilience Framework, or RVRF for short. The data for our 4 stressors each came from different sources and had different measures and scales. We defined a scale of 1 to 5 and adapted the stressor data to fit this scale and then assigned the data to the common grid. Our first stressor is flooding from rainfall based on FEMA floodplain maps. These are based on historic flooding data and included 50-year and 100-year events. Like most of the stressors in the RVRF system, flooding from rainwater shows the distinction between the hill country in the west and the prairie in the east. KTMPO has 2 large dams and 97 smaller dams used for both municipal and agricultural water supply and for flood control. Most of our dams are simple earth embankments, and their age and maintenance is a recognized issue. The possibility of a dam breach is very real, and we had one in 2018 which temporarily flooded a road in a rural area, but fortunately caused no fatalities and did little damage to our transportation infrastructure or other property. The scores for wildfire show the distinction between the ground cover in the west and in the east. It's odd to think at first that temperature affects transportation infrastructure, but actually the issue is that heavy clay soils can contract significantly under conditions of drought or extended high temperatures. This causes subsidence and rutting of roads and can damage embankments and other infrastructure. The scores for the 4 stressors gave us evaluations of the likelihood of those events happening based on historic trends and physical data, and also defined the geographic extent of the events. Another element of the RVRF is evaluating the seriousness of the effect of an event. In terms of land use, we defined 5 categories of density and use in terms of how serious an event would be. The land uses were applied to the RF grid. Additionally, we defined critical land uses as specific points to identify critical or vulnerable infrastructure, such as hospitals, jails, potentially toxic industrial sites, and electric and water infrastructure. With this data, the RVRF gives us an evaluation of the likelihood and of the severity of events for 4 environmental stressors formatted in a 1/4 mile grid for our full study area. The next step was to examine how this affects transportation infrastructure. To do this, we segmented the network to match the divisions of the grid for each stressor and applied the appropriate scores for each stressor to the network. Adding the vulnerability information to the network allows us to directly compare the vulnerability scores to our proposed road projects using the RVRF scoring spreadsheet. The spreadsheet records the raw scores for each stressor and applies the relative weights, then combines them into a single composite score. This process, up to this point, therefore, tags each roadway project with a single score in the range of 1 to 5 for compatibility with the rest of the project scoring process. This tells us the vulnerability of the area the project is in, so that the project scoring process, we can give appropriate points to project in more vulnerable areas. Part of the support for vulnerability and resilience planning we're looking at further is integration into our overall planning process. We've completed the first step of establishing data and a framework for vulnerability and resilience, and we've added the vulnerability and resilience composite score as one of the criteria in our overall project scoring process. But we recognize that there are still other areas for integration. This graphic on your screen from NCTCOG, which is the MPO for the Dallas-Fort Worth region, shows their concept of vulnerability and resilience planning as one of 15 elements considered in their project prioritization framework. The point is that vulnerability and resilience planning is not an independent element that we can just plug into our process. It affects and is affected by other elements. To further integrate it into our process, we need to review, adjust, and balance our entire process with vulnerability and resilience as one of many interrelated elements. The Regional Vulnerability and Resilience Framework is our first step in developing our capabilities. From the beginning, we've planned on a full-featured framework rather than just an isolated application. The RVRF is set up as a GIS to collect, format, and manage the data and make it easily shareable with our member jurisdictions. The RVRF was also designed from the start to output results as a single combined score to be compatible with our existing project scoring system. Now that these initial steps are complete, we are looking at the next steps to take as our system matures, and we are more fully include the vulnerability and resilience planning into our entire planning process. This will include ongoing data updates and management, new ways to share RVRF data with our members so that they can specifically develop projects to address vulnerability concerns and improve coordination with other agencies to both gather data from them and to provide data to them.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kendra, so much for that perspective of the program development. I'm going to focus on not as much on the very specifics and details on our resilience and existing program, our traditional way of approaching it, and talk a little bit more about, as we've matured, how we've moved into adjacent areas and expanded our focus to deal with some of the challenges we've had recently. So just a real quick MPO at a glance. Our MPA TMA area is about 8,800 square miles here in the Houston-Galveston region. Our region includes 5 more counties, about 12,000 square miles. That's roughly the size of Maryland. It's about 6.7 million people, which is already a pretty daunting constituency, but we plan to add about 4+ million by 2045, which in Texas terms is about 1 Amarillo per year for the next 25 years. So a fairly large and appreciable increase in population and need. Our 21 to 24 TIP identifies about $9.7 billion in transportation investment. About $1.2 billion of that is programmed through HGAC and the TIP. We have a lot of the same resiliency challenges that other jurisdictions do. Sometimes I like to just say simply, just a little bit more. One of the big challenges we have before we even start talking about the threats is we simply have a very large, a large variety of jurisdictions within our area. Not only do we have some of the largest, most affluent communities in the area, we also have very small, underserved communities. So this can lead to both a very wide disparity between the way our communities are threatened or approach resiliency planning, but also potentially some equity issues between how different communities are served and how different communities are impacted. Even though obviously resilience involves a lot more than flooding, it's hard to have a conversation in the Houston area post-Harvey that doesn't focus on water quantity to some extent. And that's partly because we're uniquely vulnerable to storm events. We're low-lying already. We don't have a lot of topographic relief. We're a coastal area, so we take direct impact from storms. And we have typically a high rainfall even in non-epic events. We get a lot of attention for Harvey, but in 2015, 2016, and 2019, we had major flooding events as well. So this is not something that is a once-in-a-while occurrence. This is an ongoing issue. Our impervious cover is pretty high. We've got a lot of pavement, and our soils are dense clay in a lot of the area, not fantastic for drainage and infiltration. And unfortunately, a lot of our industry, especially our petrochemical corridor, our transportation corridors, and some of our very dense populations, as well as some of our very underserved populations, are unfortunately in highly affected areas. When you add on the issue that we're all dealing with aging infrastructure, we have, no pun intended, we really do have a perfect storm of issues before we even start to deal with the last bullet here, the fact that we've got these growth impacts. So we're dealing not just with the existing daunting challenges that face our region in maintaining our transportation and community resilience, but trying to figure out what the future is going to bring with a tremendous amount of growth and development that's coming. So, like I said, I'm not going to go too far into our traditional planning. Kendra provided a fantastic look at how, a very similar process that we've gone through. I want to talk a little bit of how we've built on some of that and how we started to integrate it with other resilience planning that's unrelated to transportation. So a lot of what we do builds out of our existing coordination roles We deal obviously with the transportation committees. We also have a natural resource advisory committee, a regional flood management committee, et cetera, et cetera. So even though a lot of our coordination is still on the one-on-one with their local governments or through these committees as a region, we also are involved at this point in simply a lot of meta coordination. We have so many ongoing things within the region, large ongoing coordinated studies. Part of our role has become coordinating between coordinated studies. So it's very interesting to see sort of the vertical integration of everything from dealing one-on-one with a local member government to dealing with large, massive, a core study here or a flood control study here that all have their own gigantic partner bases. Part of what we've tried to do to move beyond, we're working on a formal region pilot program specifically for transportation. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, but we've also tried to adjust and coordinate as much as we can with what we're calling sort of adjacent spheres. There is no part of Houston life that is not affected by transportation or that doesn't affect transportation, whether it's our economic development, our growth planning, some of the really challenging environmental issues in terms of water and air quality, water supply, our need for conservation, and our community and quality of life, some of those equity issues, and some of just the general challenges of how do we continue to develop and maintain a quality of life within the region, our ability to get our emergency services where they need to be, and to look forward and be able to, as Charlie said, gracefully absorb the impact of disasters, because as much as I'd like to think Harvey is going to be the last one, it's just not the case. So to kind of give you an example of what we've been working on recently, our Region Resilience pilot project came out of an FHWA grant back in 2018. We did with TxDOT. We've just submitted the draft in July 2020, so this is brand new stuff. And the goal was to do a much more granular, comprehensive measurement of the criticality of our regional transportation assets and the vulnerability, and especially where those two things overlap. That would then be put toward developing recommendations to really develop a more resilient network for our local governments, but more importantly, to use these analyses and the GIS tools and the resources to inform our future decisions and to form our project selection criteria, to really build in resilience that's connected to all these adjacent spheres in a way that we really haven't before. The focus was on major roads and bridges and flooding, storm surge, and sea level rise. So unfortunately here on the coast, we don't just have water coming down the pipe, we have water coming back up. And obviously in the future, looking at the potential impact of water just being higher. I'm not going to go through this line by line, especially not the categories of strategies, but out of all the roads we have, and we've got about over 7,000 miles of major roads, about 10% of those on average were highly critical, really crucial to our operations, and about 12% of those were highly vulnerable. And unfortunately, there's some overlap there. A good deal of our critical assets were also highly vulnerable, either because they bisected some of the many waterways that traverse our region, or just because they were in low-lying areas. And that intersection is really where our priority lies and our focus lies. We built all of the complicated modeling into an online tool that included things like modeled flood exposure depth and other criteria, so that this would be usable, not just by us, but to serve as a common platform. This led to the sort of what do we do about it, and a fairly robust set of strategies. Some of them are the traditional categories, things like how we maintain our infrastructure, how we look at our infrastructure, and how we develop our transportation infrastructure, but also reaching out into some of those adjacent spheres to looking at, well, how does our upstream stormwater management really impact our stormwater? What can we do that's not in traditional transportation operations that may have a positive impact? And especially things like in that other category, again, I'm not going to go through them, but looking at natural function, looking at the ecosystem services of all the natural systems that impact or are impacted by transportation, and looking for ways to really maximize and optimize the benefit of those systems, and not just look at conservation as something that, we've got preserving the butterflies over here in the hinterlands. This is an actual tool. This is a part of our system. And this kind of led to what I'm calling embracing the adjacent. As we are growing into the complexity of our region, and as we continue to grow, it's going to be more important than ever that when we look at our regional resiliency needs, our opportunities and our needs are much greater than just the transportation sector, as much as that drives a lot of our planning. our future is really going to require a direct commitment on looking at where those things are intersecting. And I have a couple case studies of some innovative work that has been going on that I wanted to hit really quick. First is a really great multidisciplinary data project that we did looking at environmental impacts, and another one is kind of on the community planning side of things, how we're connecting this quality of life concern and issue with transportational elements. So our ecological process, this was done by a multidisciplinary planning team, folks from community development, regional demographics, our transportation folks, our environmental staff, using sort of the depth and breadth of our GIS resources to come up with a very robust GIS tool that could look at environmental impact of transportation projects. Both projects we already had spatial information for, or giving the user the ability to user-defined project. And I don't have time to talk through all the amazing pieces of this tool, but it can look at things like as simple as how much environmental land cover am I impacting of what types? You know, how much bottomland forest is this project going to impact? How many wetlands is this going to impact? But it can also look at things more specific like red flags. How many hazardous waste sites are potentially within this? You see in the example here, and I apologize, you may not see it very well. This is a Katy Prairie area on the west side of our area, and I put a hypothetical road, a highway going through here with about a 2-mile buffer on either side. And it can generate some very detailed reports. And as much as this is going to guide our transportation project submission, and it actually will be part of our transportation project submission process moving forward, we really see this as a tool where there's a lot of value to our other users, to our conservation community, to our community planning. So we can really start to have a common framework and a common language, and we're starting to rebuild some other concerns into our resiliency planning for transportation. Another good example of that is our long-standing Livable Centers project. And Livable Centers is an ongoing community planning project. It's funded by transportation dollars, but it's really focused on areas, designing areas that are walkable, have multimodal transportation, and really embody that live, work, play concept of really building a solid, functioning community. There's 3 of our projects that are really focused on transportation. Our airline district, as part of their ability to enhance the community, they really focus on using low impact development and turning movement controls, recognizing in that specific area how transportation and traffic was affecting the way that the community interacted. The same thing for our West Chase project, which specifically looked at roadway development and specifically looked at green infrastructure, recognizing those ecosystem services, both, you know, that more esoteric, you know, community sense of place and aesthetics, but also the very real impacts, the ecosystem services of infiltration and heat island reduction and everything like that. And lastly, our Mont Bellevue, one of our communities a little further out in our MPO, looking at green infrastructure as an integrated part of traffic and flooding management. So bringing those 2 spheres together as part of this greater focus on community. And that really emphasizes kind of what I wanted to talk about in terms of where our programs are going. We're no longer looking at this really as this is transportation in its box. This is the way we plan for resilience. We are really looking at resilience as that much broader concept, looking at our environmental quality and looking for ways to continue to build those bridges and strengthen those bonds. And I apologize, I know that's a lot of cliches in one slide, but really looking for ways to advance those efforts and seek those multiple benefits, because those really are, as we continue growing complexity, going to be the watchword for our future.
Howdy, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen. And my name is Bill Knowles. I work for Texas Department of Transportation, and I'll be talking about an overview of TxDOT resiliency planning. So an overview of some of our activities since the FAST Act, and I'll touch shortly on the FAST Act. is in 2018, we published a report through an interagency contract with the Texas Transportation Institute, part of Texas A&M University, developing a resilient Texas transportation system. In 2019, we held statewide resiliency stakeholder workshops. We actually only held one workshop, and we met with MPO, state, federal, and other local agencies to kind of see what everyone was doing in resiliency. And this year, we're initiating some resiliency research, and that's really where I'm going to focus on in the end, but kind of show you how we got there and what we're doing. So in the FAST Act is Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act requires state transportation agencies to address resiliency in their transportation planning processes. It requires us to develop a TAMP that integrates climate change and extreme weather event resilience approaches into transportation asset management. And how transportation agencies address these requirements is generally left up to the individual agencies. So in 2018, when we developed a transportation resiliency framework, came up with 6 steps to meet FAST Act resiliency requirements. So one is we have to define resiliency for the Texas transportation system. 2, identify resiliency goals and objectives for the Texas transportation system. 3, identify performance measures. 4, assign roles and responsibilities. 5, to assess the vulnerability of the transportation system, and that's where I'm gonna focus on really. And 6, assess, quantify the adaptation, mitigation, and recovery options. So what is a resilient transportation system? Really, what does it look like? Our framework document in November 2018 is talked about disturbances, which are external, transportation, the transportation system, which is predictable, and we have internal processes, and then impact. So the external is what we're talking about, resiliencies, environmental effects, rainfall, heat, hurricanes in Texas. Also, there are some things that aren't really exactly controllable, is the amount of growth we're getting. A lot of people are moving to Texas, land use, how many people are owning vehicles. Our transportation system, tools that we have to deal with disturbances is, land use planning, type of land use, drainage design, obviously transportation planning, our maintenance programs, and our emergency response. So when there is a disruption to system performance, you have an impact. And really what we look at resiliency is how quickly we recover from the impact. So this is what we call the Bob curve, better, okay, and bad. And so obviously we don't want to be in bad. Okay is, like I said, okay, but better is when, let's say, a hurricane hits Houston, there's going to be an outage and recovery, but the more resilient the system is, the better our recovery. So we're doing an overall assessment of the vulnerability of our transportation system, and we're going to follow the following steps. Identify and characterize extreme weather events of concern. So obviously hurricanes along the coast and droughts, and even sometimes there's wildfires. Determine the risk and likelihood of extreme weather events occurring. So hurricane season is July through November. So that's an example of, we know when they're going to occur, and then we can, work with National Weather Service. We can figure out the likelihood of the severity of the season, but no one can really predict exactly what's going to happen. Through that, we also want to identify the vulnerable transportation system elements, and that's what our future research is going to be working on, and determine the potential impact of extreme weather event if occurring, and identify our critical transportation assets. Like I said, is future research is we really want to focus on identifying the vulnerable transportation system elements. And how are we going to do this? We're going to overlay extreme weather risk data with the transportation system assets to assess the transportation system's exposure to weather events. So hurricanes hit the coastal region. I live in Austin. When hurricanes come through, typically our effect is it gets between 105 and 107 for 3 to 5 days before the hurricane hits. This is a strong sign of a hurricane approaching. And then we get some good rain that we're very excited to get in late August and September. However, if you're on the coastal regions, you're dealing with the brunt of, the severity of the hurricane. And we're going to identify the vulnerable transportation system elements. So the objective is to determine which assets have the potential of being severely impacted by the event with failure. So we have to look at the asset age. Is the roadway, older? The asset condition, what's the pavement condition? The functional attributes, is it in a low-lying area? Is it elevated? Obviously, low-lying areas are more vulnerable for flooding. And evaluate, look at the severity of events. So for example of this is from TxDOT's maintenance division. Let me try to move something. Well, I'll just move it down here. So we have identification of 500-year and 100-year floodplain. And so this is Interstate 30. This is actually northeast Texas near Texarkana on the Texas-Arkansas border. And the red areas where Interstate 30 is going through, or I'll say the magenta areas, that's where it's vulnerable to the 500-year flood. But the areas in the dark green is where the interstate is vulnerable to the 100-year flood. So this type of use of GIS assets and mapping is just by, some knowledge that we know now, like where are the floodplains, we can do some initial identification of vulnerable assets. So continuing on this topic, once the critical transportation assets have been identified, the vulnerable critical system elements can be identified using criteria such as redundancy. Is there an alternative route? So, okay, this road gets flooded. Is there an alternative? What's the level of use, current and future? That's VMT. What amount of traffic is going on? Also, the level of use could also include, is that a route to a hospital or is that a route to a school? So we have to take these things into consideration. The functional classification, which plays into kind of the big picture planning portion. The replacement cost. Is this an asset you want to preserve? Because to replace it would cost not just millions, but maybe tens of millions. And is it an element of our Texas multimodal network? Is it a freight route? Is it a common trucking route? Are there rail lines associated with this route? And also, extremely important, is this an evacuation route? We can't have evacuation routes on the coast being vulnerable. So we need to think about, giving them the highest level of protection. So all this has led up to the initiation of a TxDOT research project that kicks off September 1st, so just a couple of weeks. The title is to establish TxDOT Transportation Resilient Planning Scorecard and Best Practices. So this is to bring transportation resiliency into the planning process at the project selection process. So when we're developing our STIP and the long-range transportation plans, to give kind of a resiliency score for projects or needed maintenance to have an impact on project selection. So I want to talk about Hurricane Harvey that hit Texas a few years ago. When that hit, it really accelerated our resiliency efforts regarding the need to improve resilience for the transportation infrastructure in Texas. Future scenarios of extreme weather events in Texas will have a significant impacts on highway infrastructure. This is not an if, it's just, it's a will. And this is a picture of a roadway that's non-usable. If you ever see a roadway, it looks like this, do not try to drive across it. In Texas, we have a campaign. It says, turn around, don't drown. It only takes a few inches of water to sweep away your vehicle. I grew up in Missouri, but I moved to Texas for high school. And one of my good friends growing up, he passed away when he tried to go across a low water crossing at night. So, I mean, I've known people who've passed away, and it's better to be safe than sorry. So turn around, don't drown. So what was hurricane impact? I'll just give you a summary. A lot of people have probably read about or know about. But what happened with Hurricane Harvey, just kind of sat over the Houston Beaumont area, and it didn't move, and it just kept raining. So in some areas in the region, they got over 60 inches of rainfall, 13 million people affected. The impact was estimated at $125 billion in 2017 dollars. You know, floodwaters inundated Interstate 10 that goes from Florida to California, Interstate 45 that goes from, you know, Houston all the way up to Dallas, and US 59 that travels, you know, from Houston all the way down to the valley and then north up into East Texas. Some bridges were completely washed away, while in other areas, high waters caused significant bridge scouring, which reduced the life of those bridges. Because scouring on the pylons of bridge is now you're worried about, will the next event take the bridge out? So focusing now on the research project, our technical objectives are to examine the vulnerability of the state highway network and to establish a resiliency scorecard for integrating hazard mitigation and resiliency into local and regional transportation plans and evaluate the level of integration among transportation planning and other plans related to flood and risk management and hazardous mitigation. So obviously you saw today great presentations by the Clean Temple MPO and the Houston Galveston Area Council. And so as part of this research, we will be, you know, working in conjunction with them. We want to share our ideas and have them share their ideas and try to put together a plan for the whole state that we can all work with. And the last objective is to establish resiliency best practices and measures for integrating resiliency into TxDOT highway infrastructure planning. So when we pick projects, when we go through project selection, we want something about resiliency in the project selection process, and that's the goal of this project. So there's 6 major tasks. We're going to conduct a statewide survey of all stakeholders for highway resilience needs and gaps. So we had one a couple of years ago, but we're going to go ahead and catch up and do a new survey and see a lot of people have progressed and they're further along where they were, and maybe there's lessons learned. You know, we need to share that information so we can get a better project. Conduct a statewide vulnerability analysis on highway infrastructure networks to identify critical and vulnerable assets. This will be a lot of GIS comparing to floodplains and doing some simulation on different, you know, disaster type scenarios and to conduct the analysis. And third step is develop and test transportation resilience scorecard to evaluate the vulnerability, risk, and value of transportation assets to be used in the project development process. So we'll develop a scorecard and then we'll test and evaluate it. And once our test and evaluation is satisfactory, we'll develop guidelines and performance measures for TxDOT highway resilience. Obviously, we want to get this information out, so we're going to develop a guidebook for highway resilience planning using the scorecard, and then we'll implement this through an education process, workshops, outreach, technology transfer. Deliverables, obviously, once we complete everything, we're going to develop a technical guide. You've got to get it all written down, and there'll be a separate tool that we plan on sharing. This will be open to everyone, not just Texas, because all of our research is done through SPR funds, so it's federal. It's majority of the funds come from the feds, so this is going to be, you know, open data in essence. And then we'll continue to do technology transfer and education through, you know, the workshops I've talked about. So in summary, the focus is to build a more resilient transportation system for Texas, and by incorporating resiliency into TxDOT's planning process. We hope this addresses FAST Act requirements. We believe it does. And this aligns with TxDOT goals, which is deliver the right projects, focus on the customer, foster stewardship, optimize system performance, preserve our assets, promote safety, and value our employees. TxDOT has 12,000 employees. We are part of the traveling public, as are their families and friends. So, and that's the summary. And with that, I thank you. And from here, this is the contact information for all the presenters today. And I've been told to turn this over for Q&A.
That's right, folks. You can, oh, could you leave that last slide up, please?
I will.
Thank
I'm like adjusting something on my screen. Sorry, trying to grab something.
No problem. So folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel, and be sure, if you would, to mention who you want to answer that question. And folks, our panelists, if you want to go ahead and throw your webcams back on so we can have a good discussion and we can see your faces, that would be great. So the first question here is going to be for Kendra. I'm interested how projects were evaluated if they were located within an area identified as vulnerable from natural hazards. Did the projects mitigate these risks? And if so, how?
And to answer your question, I will actually deduct to Charlie Sullivan, who assisted us in this.
Okay. The goal of this whole process was to come up with a project score. So we looked at basically 3 items. One is if the project was vulnerable, and that's where we took the grid. We took the stressors like wildfire, flooding due to dam break, flooding due to rainfall, sustained drought or high temperature. And we looked at the likelihood of an event in that specific quarter-mile grid and applied that to the project. Then we looked at the impact. What would happen if, for example, a wildfire happened in that grid? Is there a school in the grid you have to evacuate, or a hospital or a jail? Is there a industrial site that has toxic chemicals that would release toxic smoke if they burn? Is there electrical infrastructure you have to watch out for? Is there a police station? So we looked at the likelihood, we looked at the impact, and then the third thing was a final filter. Well, let me go back. We took those 2 things, likelihood and effect, and came up with a score, made a composite score, weighted it according to weighting factors for each stressor, which is a subjective score. And then that was our vulnerability score. The idea was to give that vulnerability score to the project during project selection. The final step was resilience. If you have, for example, a low water crossing bridge, that bridge is vulnerable, but the project was a simple repaving. That repaving project didn't do anything to address resiliency. So that final filter was just a yes or no subjective score. Did the project in this vulnerable area with a score improve resilience? If it did, then that score went on to the overall project scoring process.
Thank you. And this one's for Justin. The ecological GIS analysis showed how a hypothetical road would impact environmental concerns such as wetlands, hazardous material sites, etc. Does it also consider social impacts of a new proposed road, such as displacing private homes and communities?
It's a great question. So when we originally started going through all the potential things we could put in this tool, we realized pretty quickly that it was an overwhelming list of things. So our first draft of this, and this is something that was just developed, so it's still in the testing out and working through stage, was focusing specifically on the environmental impacts. So the specific land cover impacts beyond the traditional, wetlands and drive, core permit things, and the red flags. And the red flags does start to touch on that, and that was sort of our bridge. So it includes things like, economically disadvantaged areas, institutional facilities, some of those things that would be good proxy for that. But those more community social things are what we've identified as that is a great place we need to bring this tool and move forward. As I was saying, starting to tie those spheres together. So if whoever asked the question had any specific ideas on good ways to incorporate that data, we are all ears.
Thank you. All right, Bill, you're up. When roads wash out from flooding and they do not score high for need, no hospital, no evacuation route, low traffic, etc., are roads ever left to go back to dirt roads and not repaired to full standard? It is very difficult, of course, but I wonder if the cost of having so much asphalt is too much to maintain moving forward.
That's a very good question. If a road washes out, we're going to go back, and the district is going to, TxDOT's divided into 25 districts, and so every district is responsible for the construction, operation, and maintenance within their boundaries. And so if a road would flood out, they're going to go back and repair it. The road would not be there if there wasn't a need for it. A few years ago, there floated this idea of return to dirt in some very rural areas. Some roads, they weren't really returned the dirt. They were typically turned over to county maintenance. So that's not on the table right now, but it's still early in the day. So.
Okay, thank you. This one is for everybody. You are all using spatial data in your analysis. What data was or is not available to you that you wish you had?
One of the things about resiliency planning is being new, that when you go into details, you'll find you're using a data set for something it wasn't intended for. And so I know being planners, we always want more data. One of the things we were thinking about when we were doing the Colleen project was baseline analysis. Heat and drought effects in particular are incremental and happen over time. And we thought, for example, as soil shrinks and a highway embankment might collapse, it would be really nice if we would know that's going to happen before it actually collapses. To do that, you need all kinds of data and all kinds of detail on what the baseline is and then trends over time. That's one example. Another thing is like the data on dams. We were looking at flooding from dam breaches. The big dams, we had the data sets gave us idea of how much volume there was impounded. The small dams, we had no idea how deep they were, how much water, if it did breach, how far the water would have an impact downstream. And so little bits and pieces here and there, data missing. And then things like the soil surveys and the ground cover surveys we got from federal data sets, they're at a large scale. So even though the data is there, we're not sure how precise it is. And it would be nice going further to have better data again, like every planner always wants.
I think one of our greatest challenges is recency. Is for a region that's growing, at a fairly rapid rate, the data that was good last year is not necessarily the data that's good this year. And when we're dealing with some of those same federal sources that Charlie's talking about, like NLCD land cover data, if it's updated every 5 years, that's a mountain of difference between, updates. So we've actually switched over on some of these data sources like land cover to doing those in-house as proprietary services, simply because the existing data, as good as they were, just couldn't keep up with the rate of development.
Bill, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that Charlie and Justin covered.
Okay. Let's see what's next here. For Houston, so Justin, how was criticality of facilities identified? Were there any metrics used to measure this?
And here's where I'm going to have to maybe say we'll get back to you on that. One of the things about being a large MPO is we have a fairly specialized workforce. So unfortunately, I should have a whole team behind me able to answer these technical questions. There was a fairly detailed process. It was spatial data assessed. It followed because this was an FHWA grant, specifically based on that methodology, it followed a very similar methodology. We did build in some analysis looking at that criticality and vulnerability juncture, the juxtaposition. But I'd be happy to get back with someone and provide much more detailed information. Our project is still in draft form, so some of that may be altered.
We did a little bit of that in Colleen, where we looked specifically at bridges and then at the length of the detour to take, or if that bridge were gone or out of service or something, how far people would have to go to get back en route, and to find some, if it was a above average length of the detour, that got higher score for criticality.
Charlie, let's stick with you, and then Justin, if you wouldn't mind jumping in to this question after Charlie. Let's talk about funding. How are you facilitating resiliency conversations with local municipalities that may be struggling with existing infrastructure needs?
Ooh, I'm gonna punt to Kendra. I don't know anything about the funding.
Okay.
So in regards to funding, we are just addressing those needs as they come. We are encouraging our MPO or our member jurisdictions to prepare their projects with a resiliency perspective. And as we get funding from the state, those projects will be considered in our project scoring process and funding applied as it's available and as the project is ready.
And very similar to what Kendra's talking about, that's very similar to our approach. One of the things we've been trying to do, in that same vein of connecting spheres, we have sort of an unprecedented amount of funding on the flood side these days with the Texas Water Development Board Flood Infrastructure Fund, the GLO CDBG Mitigation Fund, things that even if they're not specific to transportation infrastructure, can have a very positive impact on promoting the resiliency that therefore impacts that. So we've been doing our very best to identify and help our member governments with some of those large funding sources, simply because that is what's on the table right now, and trying to find those connections where we can make it happen for transportation, or at least get a multiple benefit.
Okay, this one for Charlie / Kendra, maybe. As growth continues, will land for water storage be included in the project, or would the future water storage be built for the future?
I didn't quite understand that. They mean how many dams are there in the area?
As growth continues, will land for water storage be included in the project?
Like water retention.
Reservoirs? In any
That's
case,
what
whenever,
I'm thinking.
Yeah, whenever there was a dam, we identified it through, there's a state inventory of dams, which was good for the larger dams, but it wasn't complete. And so we just did a visual review with Google Earth and identified all the reservoirs for drinking water and the dams, like agricultural use, that were in the area. So as the project proceeds, when they do an update, we'll identify the dams just the same way again. And again, the risk isn't that, doesn't depend on the use or on the growth, but the fact of a dam being there. And a lot of them are agricultural, and the risk is only to vacant rural land, but we still included them.
This one just came in. How many new reservoirs will be built for the future, or tag the price to the project? So how many new reservoirs will be built?
We don't have any forecast on dam construction. Okay. For drinking water, what they have is adequate. The two large lakes, Lake Melton and I just forgot the name of the other lake. Yeah, are adequate for their population and projected growth.
Okay. Bill, this one's for you. Any recommendations for a DOT that's just getting started with resiliency planning? It appears they're just working on their first vulnerability study. What recommendations do you have?
Well, I'd start some with FHWA has some resources out there, but in Texas, we'd love to share our experiences and collaborate. So that might be, a good starting point, because why start from ground zero? We've been working on this for a few years, and we'd love to share anything we have.
Thank you. This is kind of a two-part question, and I think it's kind of across the board. Do you conduct any outreach efforts in resiliency planning? So that's part one of the question. And then part two is, how does equity play a role in resiliency planning? So let's maybe kind of mush those together, and if anyone wants to take a stab at that first.
Mhm.
So I could talk about that a little bit. When we held our stakeholder workshops, equity came up, and to be a, you know, it's got to be considered in resiliency planning, because we have to be mindful of all populations, and no matter the economic value. And so that has to go into our scorecard, into what we're going to do. The tough thing about resiliency is going to be is you're going to get this giant laundry list of factors. So we're not going to try to dictate to anyone, well, this factor is a 3, this is a 4, let's say it's on a scale of 1 to 10, this one's at 8, one's a 9. I think our goal is to develop a menu and let the local regions who better know, you know, local conditions or populations and even needs to put together kind of the weighting on a scorecard. And so we're hoping to give kind of a general tool that everyone can use and maybe adapt for their specific region. So, for example, in Houston, congestion, flooding, you know, are concerns, right? But if you're in the Panhandle, they don't really have congestion, but they may have blizzards. We have a lot of diversity here in Texas, and in the Panhandle, they may be more interested in mobility and economic growth and development. So that's just an example of just, you know, needs of concerns of varying regions.
If I can mention for Colleen, we have a slightly different direction, not outreach to people, but outreach to resilience. The main reason for doing this is to incorporate resilience into the planning process. When we looked at the existing projects that are in the MTP, and historically, we found some of them contribute to resilience, but I don't think any of them were specifically aimed at increasing the resilience of the network. So the outreach was to make this process and this data and this need available to the member jurisdiction. So when the MTP comes up and they have a call for projects, first off, they know if there is an issue with resilience in any specific area. And second, they know that what they can do to have a resilient project. And third, they know that a resilient project will get more score in the project selection process. So not outreach to people, but outreach to the resilience process.
And I echo what Charlie and Bill have already said. You know, because we have so many large entities within our area who have their own established outreach programs and own messages and own brands, typically, even though our transportation department and our community departments are very active with public outreach and education, I think one of our most valuable roles is to support our member governments in doing that, to make sure they have the data, they have the tools, they have the coordination to support those messages. But we do have some active work on the equity issue in terms of, you know, I mentioned previously, things like our livable centers. You know, try to balance the incredible amount of growth and the impacts that inevitably has on equity and some of the existing equity issues in Houston, especially with equity of impact, by looking at the design of our communities and how they interact with transportation systems and how they can be both more resilient and also offer better access and more equality of access to the transportation systems that really can define outcomes.
Thank you. Next one, again, this is for anybody. As someone who works for a transit agency, how do operators work or help with resiliency planning going on at the state or MPO level?
That was one of the things we looked at, and specifically for bridges. We looked at impact of bridges, but also the bridges themselves, whether they were load restricted, functionally obsolete, whether they were on the freight route, and whether they're on the transit route. Looking at all the roads, we overlay the transit routes on them as an additional layer of impact. So the coordination between the transit agency and the resiliency planning agency is useful in adding to that score and making sure that transit is accommodated.
Anyone else have comments on that?
Just real quick, is the research we're looking at intermodal facilities, so transit will be definitely included in the goal of the scorecard.
Okay. General question for everyone again. How is everyone integrating security, like cybersecurity, CCTV, into the resiliency conversation?
That's a neat issue of vulnerability, but that's not as I did the clean, obviously. We specifically limited our number of stressors that we were looking at because this was our first iteration. Like, for example, we didn't look at hurricanes, partly because this is our new one, partly because the object is to upgrade the project scoring process, and the hurricane could happen anywhere. There wasn't any differentiator in project scoring applied to hurricanes. And I think the same thing applies to security and cybersecurity and things like that. With the Army base there, it's obvious stressor, but it's not one that we addressed in our first generation.
You know, as an pardon me, as an area that obviously a lot of high profile, highly vulnerable facilities with the petrochemical industry, with some of our large industries, and with some of our really critical. I know that's very much a concern throughout our member governments. In terms of the focus of our planning, though, I think a lot more has been driven on the disaster response side of things. So I wouldn't say that it's not been a focus, but you know, I think the primary focus has been on those other aspects of resilience.
I can see it'll become increasingly an important topic. I would just, while you were talking, I was thinking of the concept of smart traffic signals that adjust traffic signal timing and phasing to meet congestion. So if you have that system in place and you obviously have a new vulnerability, same thing with changeable message signs. They're a benefit, they're wayfinding. With any benefit, you also have the threat. So yeah, that is something we need to address in the future.
All right. Well, it looks like we get to wrap up a little early this Friday. I think we've answered all of our questions that have come through. Folks, just a reminder, we are recording this webcast and it will be available on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube, and a PDF copy of this slide deck, of everyone's slide decks, will be available on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Thanks to the Transportation Planning Division of APA for hosting today's session, and to all of our panelists for joining us. We appreciate you. Everyone, have a great weekend, and we will talk next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.